Ordered South by Robert Louis Stevenson. Read by Mark Young. By a curious irony of fate, the places to which we are sent when health deserts us are often singularly beautiful. Often, too, they are places we have visited in former years, or seen briefly in passing by, and kept ever afterwards in pious memory. And we please ourselves with the fancy that we shall repeat many vivid and pleasurable sensations, and take up again the thread of our enjoyment in the same spirit as we let it fall. We shall now have an opportunity of finishing many pleasant excursions, interrupted of yore before our curiosity was fully satisfied. It may be that we have kept in mind, during all these years, the recollection of some valley into which we have just looked down for a moment, before we lost sight of it in the disorder of the hills. It may be that we have lain awake at night, and agreeably tantalized ourselves with the thoughts of corners we had never turned, or summits we had all but climbed. We shall now be able, as we tell ourselves, to complete all these unfinished pleasures, and pass beyond the barriers that confined our recollections. The promise is so great, and we are all so easily led away when hope and memory are both in one story, that I dare say the sick man is not very inconsolable when he receives sentence of banishment, and is inclined to regard his ill health as not the least fortunate accident of his life. Nor is he immediately undeceived. The stir and speed of the journey, and the restlessness that goes to bed with him as he tries to sleep between 2 days of noisy progress, fever him, and stimulate his dull nerves into something of their old quickness and sensibility. And so he can enjoy the faint autumnal splendour of the landscape, as he sees hill and plain, vineyard and forest, clad in one wonderful glory of fairy gold, which the first great winds of winter will transmute, as in the fable, into withered leaves. And so, too, he can enjoy the admirable brevity and simplicity of such glimpses of country and country ways as flash upon him through the windows of the train, little glimpses that have a character all their own, sights seen as a travelling swallow might see them from the wing, or Iris as she went abroad over the land on some Olympian errand. Here and there, indeed, a few children huzzah and wave their hands to the express, but for the most part it is an interruption too brief and isolated to attract much notice. The sheep do not cease from their browsing. A girl sits balanced on the projecting tiller of a canal boat, so precariously that it seems as if a fly or the splash of a leaping fish would be enough to overthrow the dainty equilibrium. And yet all these hundreds of tons of coal and wood and iron have been precipitated roaring past her very ear, and there is not a start, not a tremor, not a turn of the averted head, to indicate that she has even been conscious of its passage. Herein, I think, lies the chief attraction of railway travel. The speed is so easy, and the train disturbs so little the scenes through which it takes us, that our heart becomes full of the placidity and stillness of the country. And while the body is borne forward in the flying chain of carriages, the thoughts are light as the humour moves them at unfrequented stations. They make haste up the poplar alley that leads towards the town. They are left behind with the signalman as, shading his eyes with his hand, he watches the long train sweep away into the golden distance. Moreover, there is still before the invalid the shock of wonder and delight with which he will learn that he has passed the indefinable line that separates north from south. And this is an uncertain moment, for sometimes the consciousness is forced upon him early on the occasion of some slight association, a colour, a flower, or a scent. And sometimes not until, one fine morning, he wakes up with the southern sunshine peeping through the persienne, and the southern patois confusedly audible below the windows. Whether it come early or late, however, this pleasure will not end with the anticipation, as do so many others of the same family. It will leave him wider awake than it found him, and give a new significance to all he may see for many days to come. There is something in the mere name of the South that carries enthusiasm along with it. At the sound of the word, he pricks up his ears. He becomes as anxious to seek out beauties and to get by heart the permanent lines and character of the landscape, as if he had been told that it was all his own, an estate out of which he had been kept unjustly, and which he was now to receive in free and full possession. Even those who have never been there before feel as if they had been, and everybody goes comparing and seeking for the familiar, and finding it with such ecstasies of recognition. that one would think they were coming home after a weary absence instead of travelling hourly farther abroad. It is only after he has fairly arrived and settled down in his chosen corner that the invalid begins to understand the change that has befallen him. Everything about him is as he had remembered or as he had anticipated. Here, at his feet, under his eyes, are the olive gardens and the blue sea. Nothing can change the eternal magnificence of form of the naked Alps behind Mentone. Nothing, not even the crude curves of the railway, can utterly deform the suavity of the contour of one bay after another along the whole reach of the Riviera. And of all of this, he has only a cold head knowledge that is divorced from enjoyment. He recognizes with this intelligence that this thing and that thing is beautiful, while in his heart of hearts he has to confess that it is not beautiful for him. It is in vain that he spurs his discouraged spirit, in vain that he chooses out points of view, and stands there, looking with all his eyes and waiting for some return of pleasure that he remembers in other days, as the sick folk may have awaited the coming of the angel at the pool of Bethesda. He is like an enthusiast, leading about him with a stolid, indifferent tourist. There is someone by whom he is out of sympathy with the scene, and is not moved up to the measure of the occasion, and that someone is himself. The world is disenchanted for him. He seems to himself to touch things with muffled hands, and to see them through a veil. His life becomes a palsied fumbling, after notes that are silent when he has found and struck them. He cannot recognize that this phlegmatic and unimpressionable body with which he now goes burthened is the same that he knew heretofore so quick and delicate and alive. He is tempted to lay the blame on the very softness and amenity of the climate, and to fancy that in the rigours of the winter at home these dead emotions would revive and flourish. A longing for the brightness and silence of fallen snow seizes him at such times. He is homesick for the hail rough weather, for the tracery of the frost upon his window panes at morning, the reluctant descent of the first flakes, and the white roofs relieved against the sombre sky. And yet the stuff of which these yearnings are made is of the flimsiest. If but the thermometer fall a little below its ordinary Mediterranean level, or a wind come down from the snow-clad Alps behind, the spirit of his fancies changes upon the instant, and many a doleful vignette of the grim, wintry streets at home returns to him and begins to haunt his memory. The hopeless, huddled attitude of tramps in doorways, the flinching gait of barefoot children on the icy pavement, the sheen of the rainy streets towards afternoon, the meagre anatomy of the poor, defined by the cling of wet garments, the high, canorous note of the northeaster on days when the very houses seem to stiffen with cold. These, and such as these, crowd back upon him, and mockingly substitute themselves for the fanciful winter scenes with which he had pleased himself a while before. He cannot be glad enough that he is where he is. If only the others could be there also. If only those tramps could lie down for a little in the sunshine, and those children warm their feet this once upon a kindlier earth. If only there were no cold anywhere, and no nakedness and no hunger, if only it were as well with all men as it is with him. For it is not altogether ill with the invalid after all, if it is only rarely that anything penetrates vividly into his numbed spirit, yet when anything does, it brings with it a joy that is all the more poignant for its very rarity. There is something pathetic in these occasional returns of a glad activity of heart. In his lowest hours, he will be stirred and awakened by many such, and they will spring perhaps from very trivial sources. As a friend once said to me, the spirit of delight comes often on small wings, for the pleasure that we take in beautiful nature is essentially capricious. It comes sometimes when we least look for it, and sometimes when we expect it most certainly. It leaves us to gape joylessly for days together in the very homeland of the beautiful. We may have passed a place 1,000 times and one, and on the 1,002nd it will be transfigured and stand forth in a certain splendour of reality from the dull circle of surroundings, so that we see it with a child's first pleasure, as Wordsworth saw the daffodils by the lakeside. And if this falls out capriciously with the healthy, how much more so with the invalid? Some say he will find his first violet and be lost in pleasant wonder by what alchemy the cold earth of the clods and the vapid air and rain can be transmuted into colour so rich and odour so touchingly sweet. Or perhaps he may see a group of washerwomen relieved on a spit of shingle against the blue sea, or a meeting of flower-gatherers in the tempered daylight of an olive garden, and something significant or monumental in the grouping, something in the harmony of faint colour that is always characteristic of the dress of these southern women, will come home to him unexpectedly and awake in him that satisfaction with which we tell ourselves that we are richer by one more beautiful experience. Or it may be something even slighter, as when the opulence of the sunshine, which somehow gets lost and fails to produce its effect on the large scale, is suddenly revealed to him by the chance isolation as he changes the position of his sunshade, of a yard or two of roadway with its stones and weeds. And then there is no end to the infinite variety of the olive yards themselves. Even the colour is indeterminate and continually shifting. Now you would say it was green, now grey, now blue. Now tree stands above tree like cloud on cloud, massed into filmy indistinctness. And now, at the wind's will, the whole sea of foliage is shaken and broken up with little momentary silverings and shadows. But everyone sees the world in his own way. To some, the glad moment may have arrived on other provocations, and their recollection may be most vivid of the stately gait of women carrying burthens on their heads, of tropical effects, with canes and naked rock and sunlight, of the relief of cypresses, of the troubled, busy-looking groups of sea pines that seem always as if they were being wielded and swept together by a whirlwind, of the air coming, laden with virginal perfumes, over the myrtles and the scented underwood, of the empurpled hills standing up, solemn and sharp, and of the green-gold air of the east at evening. There go many elements, without doubt, to the making of one such moment of intense perception, and it is on the happy agreement of these many elements, on the harmonious vibration of many nerves, that the whole delight of the moment must depend. Who can forget how, when he has chanced upon some attitude of complete restfulness, after long uneasy rolling to and fro on grass or heather, the whole fashion of the landscape has been changed for him, as though the sun had just broken forth, or a great artist had only then completed, by some cunning touch, the composition of the picture. And not only a change of posture, a snatch of perfume, the sudden singing of a bird, the freshness of some pulse of air from an invisible sea, the light shadow of a travelling cloud, the merest nothing that sends a little shiver along the most infinitesimal nerve of a man's body. Not one of the least of these but has a hand somehow in the general effect, and brings some refinement of its own into the character of the pleasure we feel. And if the external conditions are thus varied and subtle, even more so are those within our own bodies. No man can find out the world, says Solomon, from beginning to end, because the world is in his heart. And so, it is impossible for any of us to understand, from beginning to end, that agreement of harmonious circumstances that creates in us the highest pleasure of admiration, precisely because some of these circumstances are hidden from us forever in the constitution of our own bodies. After we have reckoned up all that we can see or hear or feel, there still remains to be taken into account some sensibility more delicate than usual in the nerves affected, or some exquisite refinement in the architecture of the brain, which is indeed to the sense of the beautiful, as the eye or the ear to the sense of hearing or sight. We admire splendid views and great pictures, and yet what is truly admirable is rather the mind within us, gathers together these scattered details for its delight, and makes out certain colours, certain distributions of graduated light and darkness, that intelligible whole which alone we call a picture or a view. Hazlitt, recording in one of his essays how he went on foot from one great man's house to another's in search of works of art, begins suddenly to triumph over these noble and wealthy owners, because he was more capable of enjoying their costly possessions than they were, because they had paid the money and he had received the pleasure, and the occasion is a fair one for self-complacency. While the one man was working to be able to buy the picture, the other was working to be able to enjoy the picture. An inherited aptitude will have been diligently improved in either case. Only the one man has made for himself a fortune, and the other has made for himself a living spirit. It is a fair occasion for self-complacency, I repeat, when the event shows a man to have chosen the better part, and laid out his life more wisely in the long run than those who have credit for most wisdom. And yet even this is not a good unmixed. And like all other possessions, although in a less degree the possession of a brain that has been thus improved and cultivated and made into the prime organ of man's enjoyment, brings with it certain inevitable cares and disappointments. The happiness of such an one comes to depend greatly upon those fine shades of sensation that heighten and harmonize the coarser elements of beauty, and thus a degree of nervous prostration that to other men would be hardly disagreeable is enough to overthrow for him the whole fabric of his life, to take, except at rare moments, the edge off his pleasures, and to meet him wherever he goes with failure and the sense of want and disenchantment of the world and life. It is not in such numbness of spirit that only the life of the invalid resembles a premature old age. Those excursions that he had promised himself to finish proved too long or too arduous for his feeble body, and the barrier hills are as impassable as ever. Many a white town that sits far out on the promontory, many a comely fold of wood on the mountainside, beckons and allures his imagination day after day, and is yet as inaccessible to his feet as the clefts and gorges of the clouds. The sense of distance grows upon him wonderfully, and after some feverish efforts and the fretful uneasiness of the first few days, he falls contentedly in with the restrictions of his weakness. His narrow round becomes pleasant and familiar to him as the cell to a contented prisoner. Just as he has fallen already out of the mid-race of active life, he now falls out of the little eddy that circulates in the shallow waters of the sanatorium. He sees the country people come and go about their everyday affairs. The foreigners stream out in goodly pleasure parties. The stir of man's activity is all about him as he suns himself inertly in some sheltered corner. And he looks on with a patriarchal impersonality of interest, such as a man may feel when he pictures himself the fortunes of his remote descendants, or the robust old age of the oak he has planted overnight. In this falling aside, in this quietude and desertion of other men, there is no inharmonious prelude to the last quietude and desertion of the grave. In this dullness of the senses, there is a general preparation for the final insensibility of death. And to him, the idea of mortality comes in a shape less violent and harsh than is its wont, less an abrupt catastrophe than as a thing of infinitesimal graduation, and the last step on a long decline of way. As we turn to and fro in bed, and every moment the movements grow feebler and smaller, and the attitude more restful and easy, until sleep overtakes us at a stride and we move no more, so desire after desire leaves him. Day by day, his strength decreases, and the circle of his activity grows ever narrower, and he feels as if he is to be thus tenderly weaned from the passion of life, thus gradually inducted into the slumber of death, and when at last the end comes, it will come quietly and fitly. If anything is to reconcile poor spirits to the coming of the last enemy, surely it should be such a mild approach as this, not to hale us forth with violence, but to persuade us from a place we have no further pleasure in. It is not so much indeed death that approaches, as life that withdraws and withers up from around about him. He has outlived his own usefulness, and almost his own enjoyment. And if there is to be no recovery, if never again will he be young and strong and passionate, if the actual present shall be to him always like a thing read in a book or remembered out of the faraway past, if in fact this be veritably nightfall, he will not wish greatly for the continuance of a twilight that will only strains and disappoints the eyes, but steadfastly awaits the perfect darkness. He will pray for Medea. When she comes, let her either rejuvenate or slay. And yet the ties that still attach him to the world are many and kindly. The sight of children has a significance for him, such as it may have for the aged also, but not for others. If he has been used to feel humanely and to look upon life somewhat more widely than from the narrow loophole of personal pleasure and advancement, it is strange how a small portion of his thoughts will be changed or embittered by this proximity of death. He knows that already, in English counties, the sower follows the ploughman up the face of the field, and the rooks follow the sower, and he knows also that he may not live to go home again and see the corn spring and ripen, and be cut down at last, and brought home with gladness. And yet, the future of this harvest, the continuance of drought, or the coming of rain unseasonably touch him as sensibly as ever, for he has long been used to wait with interest the issues of events in which his own concern was nothing, and to be joyful in a plenty, and sorrowful for a famine that did not increase or diminish by 1/2 loaf the equable sufficiency of his own supply. Thus there remained unaltered all the disinterested hopes for mankind and a better future which have been the solace and inspiration of his life. These he has set beyond the reach of any fate that only menaces himself, and it makes small difference whether he dies 5,000 years or 5,050 years before the good epoch for which he has faithfully labours. He has not deceived himself. He has not known from the beginning that he followed the pillar of fire and cloud, only to perish himself in the wilderness, and that it was reserved for others to enter joyfully into possession of the land. And so, as everything grows greyer and quieter about him, and slopes towards extinction, these unfaded visions accompany his sad decline, and follow him with friendly voices and hopeful words into the very vestibule of death. The desire of love or of fame scarcely moved him in his days of health, more strongly than those generous apparitions move him now. And so life is carried forward beyond life, and a vista kept open for the eyes of hope, even when his hands grope already on the face of the impassable. Lastly, he is bound tenderly to life by the thought of his friends, or shall we not say rather, that by their thought for him, by their unchangeable solicitude and love, he remains woven into the very stuff of life, beyond the power of bodily dissolution to undo. In 1,000 ways will he survive and be perpetuated. Much of Etienne de la Boétie survived during all the years in which Montaigne continued to converse with him on the pages of the ever-delightful essays. Much of what was truly Goethe was dead already when he revisited places that knew him no more, and found no better consolation than the promise of his own verses, that soon he too would be at rest. Indeed, when we think of what it is that we most seek and cherish, and find most pride and pleasure in calling ours, it will sometimes seem to us as if our friends, at our decease, would suffer loss more truly than ourselves. As a monarch who should care more for the outlying colonies he knows on the map, or through the report of his vice-regents, than for the trunk of his empire under his eyes at home, are we not more concerned about the shadowy life that we have in the hearts of others, and that portion in our thoughts and fancies which, in a certain far-away sense, belongs to us, than about the real knot of our identity, that central metropolis of self, of which alone we are immediately aware, or the diligent service of arteries and veins and infinitesimal activity of ganglia, which we know, as we know a proposition in Euclid, to be the source and substance of the whole. At the death of every one whom we love, some fair, unhonourable portion of our existence falls away, and we are dislodged from one of these dear provinces, and they are not, perhaps, the most fortunate who survive a long series of such impoverishments, till their life and influence narrow gradually into the meagre limit of their own spirits, and death, when he comes at last, can destroy them at one blow. Note: to this essay I must in honesty append a word or two of qualification, for this is one of the points on which a slightly greater age teaches us a slightly different wisdom. A youth delights in generalities, and keeps loose from particular obligations. He jogs on the footpathway, himself pursuing butterflies, but courteously lending his applause to the advance of the human species, and the coming of the kingdom of justice and love. As he grows older, he begins to think more narrowly of man's action in the general, and perhaps more arrogantly of his own in the particular. He has not that same unspeakable trust in what he would have done had he been spared, seeing finally that would have been little, but he has a fair higher notion of the blank that he will make by dying. A young man feels himself one too many in the world. His is a painful situation. He has no calling, no obvious utility, no ties but to his parents, and these he is sure to disregard. I do not think that a proper allowance has been made for this true cause of suffering in the youth, but by the mere fact of a prolonged existence, we outgrow either the fact or else the feeling. Either we become so callously accustomed to our own useless figure in the world, or else, and this, thank God, in the majority of cases, we so collect about us the interest or the love of our fellows, so multiply our effective part in the affairs of life, that we need to entertain no longer the question of our right to be. And so, in the majority of cases, a man who fancies himself dying will get cold comfort from the very youthful view expressed in this essay. He, as a living man, has some to help, some to love, some to correct. It may be some to punish. These duties cling not upon humanity, but upon the man himself. It is he, not another, who is one woman's son and a second woman's husband, and a third woman's father. That life which began so small has now grown, with a myriad filaments into the lives of others. It is not indispensable. Another will take the place, and shoulder the discharged responsibility. But the better the man, and the nobler his purposes, the more will he be tempted to regret the extinction of his powers, and the depletion of his personality. To have lived a generation is not only to have grown at home in that perplexing medium, but to have assumed innumerable duties. To die at such an age has, for all but the entirely base, something of the air of a betrayal. A man does not only reflect upon what he might have done in a future that is never to be his, but beholding himself so early, a deserter from the fight, he eats his heart for the good he might have done already. To have been so useless, and now to lose all hope of being useful any more, there it is that death and memory assail him. And even if mankind shall go on, founding heroic cities, practicing heroic virtues, rising steadily from strength to strength, even if his work shall be fulfilled, his friends consoled, his wife remarried by a better than he, how shall this alter in one jot his estimation of a career which was his only business in this world, which was so fitfully pursued, and which is now so ineffectively to end?